Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a new video for my newest series in which I cover the factions and houses of Ice and Fire Total War, War for Westeros. This is a mod for the game Total War Attila that overhauls and bases it in Westeros, the primary setting of Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and the A Song of Ice and Fire books. In particular, this mod is based off of the books, with the units and factions in it taking inspiration from their book counterparts as compared to the live action shows, which is something I appreciate. Because this mod chooses to discard the visual style of the shows, it means that a lot of the units in the game look more historically authentic for starters, which is nice to see and which is something we'll touch on later down the line. In this video I'll be breaking down the faction of the North, specifically the sole house it has in its roster, House Stark, looking at the history and inspiration behind the faction and its roster, before turning to its units and looking at how historically authentic units' arms and armor are. If you like the sounds of that and want to see more, like and subscribe, and the content will keep coming. As of making this video, the mod is in the very early alpha. However, even at such a stage, a lot of factions, units and maps already exist, which means there's more than enough content for me to cover for a while. Looking at the north, it's the largest kingdom in the realm, making up roughly 1/3 of Westeros south of the Wall, as the name suggests being the northernmost region, only really bordering the riverlands to the south, although its long coastlines are open to the Ironborn to the west and the Men of the Vale to the east. While it is the largest kingdom, the north is the least densely populated due to its massive size and the harshness of its terrain, making assembling large armies more difficult compared to the south. For millennia, different warring kings fought over the north, with the two most notable kings being the Stark kings of Winter and the Bolton Red kings, although eventually the north would fall under the control of the Starks, who would prevent the Andals from taking the land from the First Men, which is why millennia later the north follows the traditions and religions of the First Men in contrast to the rest of the continent. During the Targaryen conquest of Westeros, King Torrhen Stark would surrender to the Dragon Lords without a fight, the kings of the north instead becoming the Wardens of the North, a role they would serve loyally in for centuries. Hundreds of years later, when the Mad King murdered both the Lord of Winterfell and his heir, before ordering the deaths of the other Stark children, House Stark would take up arms against the Iron Throne under the command of its new lord, Ned Stark, who, fighting alongside his best friend Robert Baratheon, would overthrow the Targaryens and crown Robert as the new king. Loyally serving Robert as both the Warden of the North and then Hand of the King, Ned would be murdered for discovering the truth about the bastardy of Robert's children, leading to his son Robb taking up arms against the new King Joffrey and being declared King of the North. As of the most recent book, the North is controlled by House Bolton, who betrayed the Starks and murdered Robb, although their hold on the land is slipping as Stark loyalists rally to the banner of King Stannis Baratheon in his fight to liberate the North. In terms of historical inspirations for the North and House Stark, it's very apparent that both are based off of the northern regions of England and Scotland, with the War of the Five Kings mirroring the English War of the Roses and House Stark corresponding to the House of York, whose power base is in the north of England. With all that said, we'll turn to the units, beginning by looking at the generals, each faction normally having a heavy cavalry unit as a general, which is normally a regular unit in the roster, as well as a unique character from the books leading their own unit. For this faction, however, things are different, with House Stark having two unique general units and then a standard heavy cavalry unit. The first of these unique general units is Robb Stark with his direwolf Grey Wind. Robb, as I said earlier, was the teenage heir to House Stark, who after his father's imprisonment and death, would take up arms against the Lannisters and the Iron Throne, being crowned King of the North by his bannermen and the Lords of the Riverlands, initially fighting a successful war, although due to a series of blunders made by him and his allies, he would soon be on the back foot, with one of his main counsellors, Lord Bolton, deciding to forestall the inevitable end by betraying Robb, murdering him and most of the Northern Army, before supplanting House Stark as the rulers of the North. Looking at Robb, he rides an unarmoured horse and looks much the same as he's described in the books, except for one thing. He lacks a helmet, which I'd normally criticise due to it being the most important bit of armour. However, given he's described as wearing a helmet, it seems wrong not to have him wearing one. I understand the model wanted to show off his face, but with a helmet with a movable visor, such an effect still could have been achieved. That said, it's nice to see the red hair that Robb's distinguished by. Turning to the rest of his armour, the King of the North wears a gambeson with a mail hauberk atop it, over which he has a surcoat decorated with the grey direwolf of House Stark, a gorget being worn over the surcoat, which is historically inaccurate, as gorgets were worn under breastplates, not over the top of them. Although gorgets over the top of armour is an image that has become burned in the public's view of medieval armour by countless inaccurate depictions in movies, games and TV shows, such as Game of Thrones, where its version of Robb Stark also wears a gorget over his armour, meaning this mod makes the same mistake as the show, which is sad to see. Pauldrons protect Robb's shoulders, as do spolders over his mailed sleeves. Plate van braces and articulated gauntlets protecting his forearms and hands, plate greaves, leather boots, and a grey hooded cloak finishing off his look. Overall, Rob's armour reminds me of the transitional armour of the 1300s, where bits of plate slowly began to supplant mail as the main form of armour, although the quality of the plate components of his armour, especially his gauntlets, look more like they're out of the 16th century. For defense, he wields a round wooden shield rimmed in wood embossed with metal in the shape of a direwolf. Round shield rimmed with metal seeing wide use in the early Middle Ages by all sorts of warriors, though the design persisted on throughout the medieval era, the shield looking more like a large buckler than a full-body shield like those used by the Vikings. In conjunction with this shield, Rob wields an arming sword that looks like it could have come from the 1400s, being longer and skinnier than earlier examples, better suited at getting in the gaps of enemy armour. At his side, Rob has his pet direwolf Grey Wind, a veteran of battle who has killed many men and horses and who is typically used as an oversized attack dog. My only complaint with Grey Wind's depiction here is that he's white rather than grey, but hopefully that's a small thing that can be fixed easily. Looking at the rest of Rob's tiny unit of 4 men and a direwolf, the other men wear helmets, some being bastinets with raised visors and either attached mail or gambeson for additional head and neck protection, the bastinets looking like those seeing service in the middle of the 1300s, while others wear very early examples of great helms, being nasal helms with attached faceplates, such helmets seeing service in the 1100s during the Crusades. Apart from that, the men are only really distinguished by their choice to use either mail or leather gloves and a lack of greaves, some wearing furs over their armours to keep them warm in the cold environments of the north. While I criticise using furs as armour, here it's merely an accessory for comfort, which makes a lot of sense. Using the same shield as Rob, although some lack the wolf bossing, they would arming swords that more look to be of the 1200s as well as spears bearing the direwolf pennant. Overall, this unit is a specialty unit designed to give you the option of leading a northern army with Rob and Grey Wind at its head. As interesting as that can be, however, the tiny size of the unit and the relative lack of impact it can have on a battlefield is more than enough reason for me not to recommend fielding these guys, unless of course you really want to have a direwolf in your army. If it's just Rob, however, that you want, there's a far better unit that you can choose as general, and that's Robb Stark with no Grey Wind. Well, this unit is just called Robb Stark with no Grey Wind. In reality, it's Rob with his household guard, so I'll refer to the unit as such, skipping Rob, who's equipped identically to before. The men in the unit also ride unarmoured horses, wearing the exact same mix of armour, fur, swords, lances and shields we saw previously, although some in the unit wear brigandine cuirasses, that is to say segmented plate armour for defence. This type of armour also coming to prominent use during the transitional period between plate and mail, as smaller pieces of plate were easier to forge than single-piece breastplates and cuirasses, although brigandines would see widespread service to the end of the Middle Ages by both lesser warriors and nobility. Apart from the brigandine, some of the warriors also have flat-top helms with faceplates rather than nasal helms with faceplates, the flat-top variety seeing heavy use in the 12th and 13th centuries. Turning to their unit role, these guys are Silver Tier 2 medium shock cavalry, not being the toughest or heaviest cavalry in the world, which makes sense given heavy horses are one of the North's focus, given its worship of the old gods rather than the Seven and its associated knighthood. Still, the unit is a nasty one to face on the battlefield, being good at breaking enemies with hammer and anvil charges. I'd recommend it as a general over the other options purely for the fact it has better stats and that the unit is larger, meaning it can cause and absorb more damage before breaking compared to Rob and Grey Wind. With Rob and his household guard covered, let's turn to the regular units the faction can field, starting with the Winterfell Gatekeepers. Looking at their armour, they mostly wear nasal helms of both the ridged and single-piece design, with either gambeson or mail coifs and standards being worn, with the helmets to provide head and neck protection, some men wearing seveliers without any nasal bars instead. Such helmets saw widespread use in the 11th and 12th centuries, although by the 13th century they were getting outdated. To protect their bodies, the men seem to wear mail hauberks over which they wear gambeson, some of the padded textile armour being decorated with the Stark wolf sigil, while others lack it. For their arms, the men rely on a mix of mail sleeves and gloves, with leather gloves and gambeson sleeves also making an appearance. In regards to their legs, the soldiers mostly rely on gambeson leggings and leather boots, although some have mail pants and others have pollens for their knees, these taking the shape of either regular plate pollens or small round plates attached to padding worn over the knees. Choosing not to use shields, instead the men use bills as their weapon of choice, bills being a widespread weapon in England especially, where they were used by normal infantry rather than the halberds or pikes seeing use in continental armies during the late Middle Ages. Seeing this weapon in the hands of the Stark forces also makes a lot of sense given that House Stark is based primarily off of an English noble house, so it makes sense for them to use a quintessentially English weapon, especially one which can fend off horses and knock down and grab armoured foes. Turning to the officer, he's armoured like one of Rob's bodyguards, with a brigandine protecting his chest and a bassinet, with a faceplate worn to keep his head safe. It's what's worn over his helmet, however, that makes him stand out, as he wears a wolf skin to help distinguish him from his troops. Such adornments were worn by warriors historically, such as the Roman Velites, who were skirmishers known for wearing animal skins, most prominently wolf skins. Apart from the wolf skin, the officer uses the same shield and sword seen previously. As a unit, these guys are silver tier 2 medium polearm infantry who do quite well as shock infantry and as a defensive unit, being highly dangerous to start cavalry, although they are vulnerable to being charged by horsemen, and archers pose a threat to them due to their lack of shields and plate armor. As such, I suggest including a few of these in your army as a reserve to throw in at either engaged enemy horsemen or weak points in either the enemy lines or yours, so they can salvage a situation or maul enemy infantry. Overall, a useful unit that will see a fair bit of service in the armies of House Stark. Moving on to the next unit, the Wolfswood Hunters make an appearance. The Wolfswood is a giant forest in the west of the north which is noted for its bowmen, these being those men. Looking at their armour or lack thereof, most of the men wear their regular clothing, although some wear padded shirts and pants, some having leather braces on their forearms while others lack them, all however wearing leather gloves and boots, although some also wear mantles and hoods to give them additional stealth. Having only daggers at their side, the main weapon of these men are their short hunting bows, which are better suited to killing large game rather than armoured foes. Skipping their standard officer who doesn't wear a wolfskin this time, as a unit, these guys are your early game archers, being a bronze tier 1 light bow infantry unit. While this means that they're not capable of going toe-to-toe with professional archers fielded by other factions, the unit can actually see service in late game armies as a support unit due to the many special effects the unit has, being able to guerrilla deploy, meaning they can be set up ahead of your army to ambush enemy forces, which combined with their snipe and stalk abilities allow them to move around the map and shoot without being detected, making them quite the unit to add to your armies for additional firepower. Ironically enough, while this is the only bronze tier unit the faction currently has, meaning you have to rely on them to be your whole army, because it's such a good unit, you can actually just use them to stealthily wear down an enemy army without ever having to engage them in melee that these guys will no doubt lose. A great unit that you'll be forced to use, but that you'd be a fool not to want to use. Turning to the next unit, we have the Stark Men-at-Arms. Armoured identically to the Winterfell Gatekeepers, these men use larger versions of the rimmed bucklers used by Robb Stark in combination with 14th century arming swords. Because of this, the unit mostly looks like Norman infantry of the 11th century, who used round shields rather than the kite shield used by Norman knights. A great looking unit, my only complaint is one you're going to be hearing often in these videos, that being that a man-at-arms historically was a heavy cavalryman of the late Middle Ages, who fulfilled the same role as a knight without necessarily having the rank, although many knights were also men-at-arms. What men-at-arms were not were regular infantry in the service of a lord as standard soldiers, although due to decades of exposure to the idea of men-at-arms serving as such in pop culture such as books, shows, movies and games, it's not difficult to see why these soldiers are considered as such, especially when they're referred to as men-at-arms in the A Song of Ice and Fire books. So in a way, the modders are being authentic to their source by calling it such, although personally I'm not a fan. Skipping their officer, these guys are your standard line infantry, being silver tier 2 medium sword infantry. More or less a match for most other factions' equivalent unit, this unit will make up the core of your offensive infantry on any battlefield, working well in conjunction with spearmen and buy them time to polish them off. A highly useful unit, these troops will often see a lot of service, even on the defensive in sieges where they can hold the line well before switching to go on the offensive. Turning to the next unit available in the House Stark roster, we have the Stark Spear Sergeants. Equipped the same as the men-at-arms when it comes to armour and shields, these men are distinguished by their weapon of choice, the ubiquitous spear. Spears were the most common weapon historically, as well as in A Song of Ice and Fire, so it makes sense to see them being used here. Skipping their officer who does wear a wolf skin, these guys are your standard spear infantry, being the bulk of your army, being silver tier 2 medium spear infantry. Able to hold the line against attacking foes, these guys are equally useful on the open battlefield and in sieges, where they're best used in my opinion to defend the flanks of your more vulnerable infantry like pikemen. A great unit to ward off cavalry, don't expect these guys to be battle winners, but do expect them to play a key role in bringing about a win. Turning to the next unit, we have the Winterfell pikemen who wear the same armour seen before but without shields, instead choosing to use a pike as their main weapon. Pikes were a weapon that saw increasing use throughout the Middle Ages, with pike blocks being the supreme form of warfare by the very end of the period, although funnily enough the English didn't really adopt the weapon in the Middle Ages, the weapon of choice when it came to polearms being the bill, although by the early modern period the English had also adopted pike and shot. Looking at these pikes, my main problem with them is the hook they've got next to the tip, which wasn't seen on historical pikes due to the fact that pikes were meant solely for stabbing, not hooking foes the way halberds and other polearms were. Add to that, the pike heads were made as light as possible so as to reduce the weight the pikemen would have to carry, and the stress on the wooden shaft and having a hook on the pike makes less sense. Skipping the officer who lacks a cloak, we'll turn to the unit role. Silver tier 2 medium pike infantry. These guys are best used in the center of your army where they can bulldoze a path through enemy infantry and cavalry. Spearmen protecting their vulnerable flanks, for if the unit is flanked or hit from the rear, it will collapse in short order. Especially deadly against horsemen, I'd watch out for archers, as due to the lack of shields and heavy armor, these guys are somewhat vulnerable, although all in all, this unit will serve as a redoubt for your forces on the open battlefield, and in sieges is perfect for holding choke points or breaking up formations holding choke points. A great unit overall, although one that you will have to take great care with in regards to deployment, lest you lose a valuable asset. Moving on, the next unit, the Northern Longbows, make an appearance. Wearing the same armour seen previously, these men keep falchions at their side in case of melee, which is good to see. Falchions being a widely used type of sword, especially by support troops such as archers, although regular infantry use them too. The main weapon used by these men, of course, is the longbow, a weapon most famously associated with the longbowmen of England and Wales, who used the weapon to great success in the High and Late Middle Ages. It makes sense that the Northerners would use the longbow as their primary ranged weapon, compared to other factions who used both the longbow and the crossbow, due to the more technologically advanced aspects of the crossbow, which don't fit with the North as well as the Southern Kingdoms. Skipping the standard officer, these guys are your range strength in mid to late game armies, mostly supplanting the Wolfswood Hunters, although as I said earlier, those guys work well in combination with these silver tier 2 light archers, the Northern Longbows being better able to contend with enemy infantry with flanking and rear attacks, though it should be noted that you don't want to use these guys as your frontline troops, as they'll easily fall to cavalry and shock infantry. Overall, a unit that will be a common sight in Northern armies due to the important role they play. Moving on to the catapult, the sole artillery unit fielded by the faction, is crewed by men wearing the same standard northern varieties of armour but with 2 falchions and a dagger at their sides, making them surprisingly well armed for support infantry. Catapults are among the most useful units in the faction's roster, as they give House Stark the ability to bombard enemy armies and punch holes in enemy fortifications, making sieges that much easier than just taking settlements by storm, with the siege equipment also allowing you to defend your castles more easily by shooting attacking catapults. Overall, a unit that if missing from the roster would make winning battles and campaigns as a Starks so much harder. Turning to the next available unit, we have the Sworn Spears of House Stark, who to a man are equipped like Rob's household bodyguard, using the standard round shields in conjunction with spears, some of the spears having Stark pennants attached. Skipping their officer, these are silver tier 2 heavy spear infantry, who it would seem are a cut above the regular spear sergeants. However, when it comes to the stats, both units are almost identical, with the Sworn Spears having just slightly better armour. It's for this reason that I wouldn't recommend replacing the Spear Sergeants with these guys, instead using them as a support unit to beef up your shield walls rather than relying on them as the bulk of your army, unless you really want that slight increase in stats for your forces. Overall, a very cool looking unit, but not one that I'd often recommend. Moving on, we come to their sword variant, the Sworn Swords of House Stark, who have the same armour and shields, but instead wield a variety of arming swords, some looking more like examples from the late Middle Ages, while others resemble arming swords of the High Middle Ages. Skipping their wolfskin wearing officer, these guys are intended to step up from the Stark men-at-arms. When it comes to the stats though, it's the same idea as the Sworn Spears, having the exact same stats with only slightly higher armour, meaning my same point as before stands here. I'd still use the regular men-at-arms and keep these guys as a limited support unit at best, unless that extra armour means enough to you for you to replace all your men-at-arms. Overall, another cool looking unit, but not one that's critical at the end of the day. Moving on, we come to the sole cavalry unit the faction can field, the Stark Free Riders. Essentially the men-at-arms on unarmoured horses, these troops use a smaller round buckler in combination with spears used as lancers. Skipping the officer who's distinguished by the use of a lance rather than a spear bearing the Stark sigil, these guys are not only your only cavalry unit, but can also serve as your general if you choose not to use Rob. Personally, I recommend using Rob without Grey Wind as your general over these guys, as despite being silver tier 2 medium shock cavalry who outnumber the men in Rob's unit 2 to 1, Rob's unit has far superior stats allowing it to hit way harder and cause more damage, which is what you want from a general. Instead, I'd use these guys as the mounted arm of your forces, using them to destroy enemy cavalry before wheeling in to attack enemy infantry from the flanks and rears. A pretty good unit that serves well in its role despite being underpowered compared to the more cavalry-oriented armies of some of the other factions. I have one major complaint with the unit, and that's its name. Free Riders in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe are like cavalry who serve as scouts and mounted mercenaries, attaching themselves to armies in an effort to make money. What they are not is shock cavalry who are more or less mounted men-at-arms. Having Free Riders, the lowest of cavalry, serving as a general is quite a bad choice as far as I'm concerned and makes no sense in the universe. Because of this, I'm going to offer my support to the mod creators if they want it when it comes to naming units and giving them more fitting roles. with this unit I think being better off being called the Stark Mounted Men-at-Arms rather than Free Riders, although that's just my opinion. Speaking of which, I want to hear your guys' opinion in the comments to see what you think of the situation as it stands. With that little rant out of the way, let's turn to the final unit the faction can field, the Winter Wolves. Armor-wise, these men are equipped almost identically to the Stark Sworn swords, although all of them have either furs on their chests or wear wolfskin cloaks over their helmets. The helmets also setting them apart as they wear a mix of sugarloaf and flat-top great helms, which look amazing and contribute to the unit more or less looking like it's out of the late 1200s, although the oculari, the eye holes on some of their helmets, look a bit large. Dropping shields, these men instead wield massive two-handed swords reminiscent of the Zweihanders, used primarily in the German states in the 15th and 16th centuries. These weapons being closer to polearms and swords in use, smashing holes in enemy ranks with ease. Skipping the unit officer, as a unit, these gold tier 3 very heavy shock infantry are the most elite unit the faction has access to, being the spear tip of your army which can decimate the units it attacks. While they are more vulnerable to ranged units and cavalry due to their lack of shields, if they get stuck in the cavalry or archers, the enemy unit stands no chance. I'd recommend recruiting a few of these guys to smash through enemy units with supporting men-at-arms coming in behind them, the unit being useful in sieges both of breaking enemy choke points and in cutting down overextended attackers. Overall, a fantastic unit to finish off the faction roster, though I do have one complaint for the unit. Coming yet again to another flaw with names, in universe, the Winter Wolves was a name given to the small northern army sent as a vanguard to support Rhaenyra Targaryen in the Dance of the Dragons, where the Winter Wolves will become legendary for their ferocious assaults on green armies. However, unlike the unit in the mod, which is elite shock infantry, the Winter Wolves in the books were older men who were ready to leave their homes and die so as to allow their families to survive winter. So calling these well-armored and armed troops Winter Wolves seems off to me, though I'm guessing it's as a homage to that old army. That said, still a great unit. With these guys covered, all the units in the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to the faction as a whole. Overall, House Stark of the North are a faction that focuses more or less on regular infantry to the detriment of their ranged forces to a limited degree, and their cavalry severely. Well, this means that you have to rely on your normal troops to carry the day, with archers and cavalry taking a backseat, although the specialist archers the faction has access to allows you to vary between infantry armies and stealth archer forces, making for a nice contrast. Overall, I'd say that House Stark as it stands are a more basic faction with a more standard playstyle, making them more appealing to beginning players, resembling House Greyjoy but without the emphasis on rapid attacks by shock infantry. A cool faction with a nice roster. I can't wait to see the units available to the faction expand in the future. If you guys have enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, let me know in the comments and please like and subscribe. I know it may not seem like much for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. Rest assured, more videos on this mod and others will be coming up in the future. With all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.